Thomas Whitfield had been guarding the royal family for 37 years. At 62, his hair had turned silver, and deep lines marked his weathered face.
How?
But his posture remained as straight as the day he first put on the ceremonial uniform. Every morning at precisely 5 a.m., Thomas would arrive at Windsor Castle, adjusting his red tunic and checking his appearance in the small mirror by the entrance. His colleagues often joked that Thomas bled royal blue, so complete was his dedication. To the crown, the other guards respected Thomas, not just for his long service, but for the quiet dignity he brought to every duty. He never complained about the long hours standing in uncomfortable positions, never grumbled about tourists who tried to make him laugh or children who pulled faces at him. Thomas understood that he was more than just a guard. He was a living symbol of British tradition and royal protection. Thomas lived alone in a small cottage about 20 minutes from the castle. His wife Margaret had passed away 5 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, and their only son lived in Australia. With his own family, the loneliness of his personal life made his work even more important to him. The royal family and his fellow guards had become his true family, the people who gave meaning to his days and purpose to his existence. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Thomas noticed something different about the atmosphere at the castle. There were more officials than usual hurrying through the corridors, and several senior staff members were speaking in hushed tones. As someone who had worked at the castle for decades, Thomas could sense when something important was happening. Even if he wasn't directly involved in the decisions being made, during his morning briefing, Captain Harrison seemed more serious than usual. Security protocols were being updated, and there would be additional checkpoints and procedures in the coming weeks. Thomas listened carefully to every instruction, taking mental notes as he always did. His attention to detail and reliability had made him one of the most trusted guards in the castle's security force. After the briefing, Thomas took his position at the North Terrace, one of the most prestigious posts that was usually assigned to the most experienced guards. From this position, he could see the gardens stretching out below and watch the early morning staff preparing the grounds for another day of royal activities. The autumn air was crisp, and Thomas pulled his shoulders back, preparing for another day of silent vigilance. Around midday, Thomas noticed Dr. Elizabeth Morrison approaching his position. Dr. Morrison was the castle's senior physician, someone Thomas had seen many times over the years, but had rarely spoken to directly. She was carrying a medical bag and seemed to be looking specifically for him, which was unusual since guards typically went to the medical office if they needed attention. "Sergeant Whitfield," Dr. Morrison said with a gentle smile, "I wonder if I might have a word with you during your break. Nothing urgent, just a routine matter I'd like to discuss." Thomas nodded politely, though he found the request odd. He couldn't remember the last time he had needed medical attention, and his annual physical examination wasn't due for several months. But Dr. Morrison's tone was friendly and professional, so he agreed to meet her in the medical office during his lunch break. The rest of his morning shift passed normally, with tourists gathering outside the castle walls and staff members going about their daily routines. Thomas acknowledged the nods from other guards as they changed positions, participated in the ceremonial changing of the guard, and maintained his professional demeanor throughout every interaction. When lunchtime arrived, Thomas made his way to the medical office, wondering what Dr. Morrison might want to discuss. The medical facility was located in one of the castle's older sections, with stone walls and narrow corridors that spoke to centuries of history. Thomas had always found comfort in these ancient surroundings, feeling connected to the generations of guards who had served before him. Dr. Morrison was waiting for him with a warm smile, but Thomas noticed that her expression seemed more serious than their earlier encounter had suggested. She gestured for him to sit in a comfortable chair across from her desk, and Thomas noticed that she had prepared a file with his name on it. "Sergeant Whitfield, I want to thank you for taking the time to meet with me," Dr. Morrison began. "I know how dedicated you are to your duties, and I appreciate your service to the royal family over all these years." Thomas felt a slight uneasiness at her formal tone. In his experience, when people began conversations by thanking you for your service, it often meant they were about to deliver news you didn't want to hear. "I've been reviewing some test results from your last physical examination," Dr. Morrison continued, opening the file on her desk. "There were a few abnormalities that I'd like to discuss with you. I think it would be best if we arranged for some additional tests to get a clearer picture of your overall health." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat, but he maintained his composed exterior. After 37 years of maintaining discipline under pressure, he wasn't going to show weakness now, even in a doctor's office. "What kind of abnormalities, doctor?" Thomas asked in his steady, professional voice. Dr. Morrison explained that his blood work had shown some irregularities that could indicate various conditions. Some serious, and others easily treatable. Necessary before any definitive diagnosis could be made. But her tone suggested that she was genuinely concerned about what they might find. As Thomas listened to the medical terminology and explanations, his mind drifted to Margaret and the months of hospital visits that had preceded her death. He remembered the careful way doctors had spoken to them, the gradual revelation that her condition was more serious than initially thought, and the long battle that had ultimately ended in loss. But Thomas also remembered Margaret's strength. During those difficult months, her determination to face whatever came with dignity and grace. If he was facing his own health challenge, he would meet it the same way, with the same steadfast courage that had defined his service to the Crown. The following week brought a series of medical appointments that Thomas approached with the same methodical precision he applied to his guard duties. He scheduled the tests around his work shifts, never missing a day of service and never allowing his personal concerns to affect his professional performance. His fellow guards noticed nothing different about his demeanor, which was exactly how Thomas wanted it. Dr. Morrison had arranged for Thomas to see Dr. Andrew Collins, a specialist at the London hospital who had experience with the type of condition she suspected. Thomas took the train into London on his day off, wearing his best civilian clothes and carrying the medical files in a neat folder. The journey gave him time to think about his life and what these tests might reveal as the train moved through the English countryside. Thomas reflected on his decades of service. He thought about the many ceremonies he had participated in, the royal weddings and state visits he had helped secure, and the countless quiet moments when he had simply stood guard, protecting the people and traditions he held dear. If his time was limited, he wanted to make sure it counted. Dr. Collins was a kind man in his 50s who spoke with the same careful professionalism that Thomas appreciated in his military colleagues. After reviewing the test results and conducting additional examinations, Dr. Collins confirmed what Thomas had begun to suspect from Dr. Morrison's concerned expressions. "Sergeant Whitfield, I'm afraid the tests confirmed that you have a serious condition," Dr. Collins said gently. "The cancer is advanced, and while there are treatment options available, I need to be honest with you about the prognosis." Thomas listened as the doctor explained the medical details, the treatment possibilities, and the realistic timeline he was facing. The words washed over him like reports from a distant battlefield, important information that needed to be processed and understood, but not something that would cause him to panic or lose his composure. "How long do I have, doctor?" Thomas asked directly, preferring clear facts to comforting evasions. "With treatment, possibly 18 months to 2 years. Without treatment, perhaps 6 to 8 months. But these are estimates, Sergeant. Every case is different, and some patients exceed expectations significantly." Thomas nodded, filing away the information as he would any important briefing. "What would treatment involve, and how would it affect my ability to continue working?" Dr. Collins explained the chemotherapy protocols, the side effects Thomas could expect, and the impact the treatment would likely have on his energy levels and physical capabilities. The picture that emerged was of months of difficult treatment that might extend his life, but would certainly prevent him from continuing his duties as a royal guard. That evening, Thomas sat in his cottage garden, looking out over the countryside he had called home for so many years. Margaret's rose bushes were still blooming despite the late season, and Thomas took comfort in their persistent beauty. He thought about the choice he was facing, aggressive treatment that might give him more time, but would force him to abandon his life's work, or continuing his service until he was no longer physically able to perform his duties. For Thomas, the decision wasn't really a choice at all. His identity was completely intertwined with his service to the Crown. He had no family nearby, no hobbies or interests that gave his life meaning outside of his work. The idea of spending months in hospitals and treatment centers, watching his strength fade while others took over his responsibilities, felt like a betrayal of everything he had dedicated his life to. The next morning, Thomas called Dr. Collins and informed him of his decision. He would not pursue aggressive treatment. Instead, he wanted to continue working for as long as possible, medical support to manage his symptoms and maintain his quality of life. Dr. Collins tried to persuade him to reconsider, explaining that early treatment offered the best chance of extending his life. But Thomas was firm in his decision. He had lived his life on his own terms, in service to something greater than himself, and he intended to face his final months the same way. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but I've made my choice," Thomas said with quiet dignity. "I've spent 37 years protecting the royal family, and I intend to continue doing so until I physically cannot. That's who I am, and it's how I want to be remembered." Thomas returned to work the following day, carrying his secret with the same discipline he had maintained throughout his career. He began each shift with renewed appreciation for the privilege of serving, knowing that each day might bring him closer to the time when he would no longer be able to stand guard. But as the weeks passed, Thomas discovered that he wasn't carrying his burden alone. Dr. Morrison began checking on him more frequently, always finding professional reasons to visit his post or invite him for brief consultations. It started assigning him to positions that were less physically demanding, though he did so subtly enough that Thomas's pride remained intact. Most remarkably, Thomas began to notice small acts of kindness from his fellow guards that suggested they sensed something was different. Even if they didn't know the specific details, someone would always volunteer to take his shift if he seemed tired. His favorite tea would mysteriously appear in the break room. Fellow guards would engage him in conversations about their families and personal lives, including him in a way that had become less common as he had grown older and more isolated. Thomas realized that his decades of quiet service had created a network of respect and affection that he had never fully appreciated. The royal family he had devoted his life to protecting included not just the actual royals, but the entire community of staff and guards who shared his commitment to something greater than themselves. As autumn turned to winter, Thomas felt his strength beginning to ebb, but his resolve remained as strong as ever. He had made his choice, and he would see it through with the same unwavering dedication that had defined his entire career. Was determined to remain loyal to the crown until the very end, standing tall and serving with honor until the moment he could serve no longer. By December, Thomas could no longer hide the subtle changes that his illness was causing. His uniform, always perfectly fitted, had begun to hang loose on his diminishing frame. His face, once full and healthy, had taken on the gaunt appearance that comes with serious illness. But most tellingly, the man who had never shown fatigue during 37 years of service occasionally needed to shift his weight or take a deeper breath during long ceremonial duties. Captain Harrison had noticed these changes, and after consulting with Dr. Morrison, he made a decision that would have significant implications for Thomas's remaining time. Rather than removing Thomas from active duty or forcing him into medical leave, Harrison chose a different approach that honored both Thomas's wishes and his remarkable service record. During a private meeting in his office, Captain Harrison spoke to Thomas with the directness that military men appreciated. "Sergeant Whitfield, I know you haven't shared details about your health situation, and I respect your privacy. But I also know that you're facing challenges that would have forced most men to step down months ago." Thomas maintained his professional posture, but his eyes showed gratitude that his superior understood the situation without requiring explanations or admissions that would compromise his dignity. "I'm implementing a new protocol," Harrison continued. "We're creating a senior advisor position that will allow you to share your knowledge with younger guards while still maintaining an active role in castle security. You'll have modified duties that recognize your experience and expertise." It was a compassionate solution that allowed Thomas to continue serving while acknowledging the reality of his declining health. The position would involve training new recruits, consulting on security protocols, and serving as a ceremonial guard during important events when his presence would be most meaningful. Thomas accepted the new role with the quiet grace that had characterized his entire career. He understood that Harrison was offering him a way to maintain his dignity while ensuring he received the support he needed during his final months of service. The other guards quickly understood what was happening, even without official explanations. Thomas's new role was accompanied by subtle changes in how his colleagues interacted with him. Guards who had always been respectful became genuinely protective, ensuring that Thomas was never left to handle difficult situations alone, and that he always had support when he needed it. James Mitchell, guard 20 years Thomas's junior, began arriving early for his shifts to spend time learning from Thomas's vast experience. "Sergeant, could you tell me about the protocols for state visits?" James would ask, giving Thomas opportunities to share his knowledge while resting between duties. Sarah Williams, one of the few female guards in the unit, made it her mission to ensure Thomas ate properly during his breaks. She would bring extra sandwiches or soup, claiming she had accidentally packed too much food, and would sit with Thomas while he ate, engaging him in conversations about his early years at the castle. Even the younger guards, who had initially been intimidated by Thomas's reputation and seriousness, began seeking his advice and including him in their casual conversations. They seemed to understand instinctively that they were in the presence of someone whose time was precious and whose knowledge was irreplaceable. The royal family members themselves began to notice Thomas in ways they hadn't before. During ceremonies and official functions, they would make brief eye contact and nod acknowledgement in a manner that went beyond the usual formal recognition. It was as if they sensed that this particular guard's service had a special quality that deserved additional respect. Dr. Morrison continued to monitor Thomas's condition, but she had adapted her approach to support his decision to continue working. Instead of pressuring him to pursue aggressive treatment, she focused on managing his symptoms and ensuring he had the medication and support needed to maintain his quality of life while serving. "Thomas," she said during one of their regular consultations, "I want you to know that what you're doing is remarkable. Most people in your situation would have stepped away from work months ago, but you're showing extraordinary courage and dedication." Thomas appreciated her understanding, but he didn't see his choice as particularly courageous. For him, continuing to serve was simply the natural expression of who he was and what his life had meant. The idea of spending his final months as a patient rather than a protector felt like abandoning his essential identity. As winter deepened, Thomas found himself reflecting more deeply on the meaning of loyalty and service. He had always understood these concepts intellectually, but facing his own mortality gave them a profound emotional weight that enriched every moment of his remaining time. During quiet moments at his post, Thomas would observe the daily life of the castle with new appreciation. The ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of history, the ceremonies that connected the present to the past, the dedicated staff who maintained traditions that were larger than any individual life, all of these elements felt more precious and significant than ever before. Thomas also began to understand that his decision to continue serving was having an impact beyond his own satisfaction. His colleagues were witnessing something extraordinary, a demonstration of loyalty and dedication that would influence their own approach to service for years to come. Without intending to, Thomas was teaching a masterclass in honor and commitment. Younger guards would later speak about this period as a turning point in their understanding of what it meant to serve the crown. They were watching someone face the ultimate test of character and respond with unwavering dedication to duty. It was a lesson that no training manual could provide and no classroom instruction could replicate. As Christmas approached, Thomas felt a deep sense of fulfillment despite his physical challenges. He was surrounded by people who respected and cared for him. He was continuing to serve the institution he loved, and he was demonstrating that loyalty to the crown meant exactly what it said: faithfulness until the very end, the castle's Christmas. Preparations took on special meaning for Thomas, knowing this would likely be his last holiday season in service. But rather than feeling sad about endings, he felt grateful for the privilege of experiencing one more Christmas as a guardian of traditions that would continue long after he was gone. January brought an unexpected visitor to Windsor Castle that would change Thomas's final months in ways he could never have anticipated. His son Michael had flown in from Australia, having been contacted by Dr. Morrison when Thomas's condition had worsened. The reunion between father and son was emotional but private. Taking place in Thomas's cottage away from his workplace, Michael was shocked by his father's appearance, but even more amazed by his determination to continue working. "Dad, you should be resting, getting treatment, spending time with family," Michael said with tears in his eyes. "Why are you still going to work every day?" Thomas struggled to explain something that felt as natural to him as breathing. "This is who I am. It's these people, this place, this service. It's not just my job, it's my life. I can't abandon it now when they need me to show them what loyalty really means." Michael had planned to stay for a week, but after witnessing his father's dedication and the extraordinary care he was receiving from his colleagues, he extended his visit indefinitely. He took a leave of absence from his job in Sydney and moved temporarily into his childhood home. Determined to support his father during these final months, the presence of Thomas's son added a new dimension to the support network that had formed around the veteran guard. Michael began visiting the castle regularly, not as an outsider, but as someone who was welcomed into the extended family that his father had served for so many years. Captain Rassin took time to show Michael around the castle and explained the significance of his father's service. "Your father is a legend here," Harrison told Michael, as they walked through the corridors where Thomas had worked for decades.
Oh.
"The younger guards look up to him as the embodiment of what it means to serve with honor. He's teaching them lessons about character that will influence their entire careers." Michael began to understand that his father's decision to continue working wasn't stubbornness or denial about his condition. It was a conscious choice to use his remaining time to demonstrate the values he had lived by throughout his career. Thomas was showing everyone around him what it meant to face adversity with dignity and to remain committed to something greater than personal comfort. Dr. Morrison noticed positive changes in Thomas's condition that she attributed partly to having his son nearby and partly to the continued sense of purpose he derived from his work. While the cancer continued to progress, Thomas's spirits remained remarkably strong, and he seemed to have found an inner peace that helped him manage his physical symptoms. "Having Michael here has made a tremendous difference," Dr. Morrison observed during one of their consultations. "But I think your continued service is equally important to your well-being. You've found a way to face this challenge that honors who you are as a person." As winter turned to spring, Thomas's colleagues began to understand that their time with him was limited. Rather than becoming morbid or overly sentimental, they found ways to celebrate his presence while he was still able to serve. Around Thomas became one of appreciation and gratitude, rather than sadness and pity. The guards organized informal gatherings where Thomas could share stories from his decades of service. These sessions became legendary among the castle staff, as Thomas revealed details about historical events, famous visitors, and behind-the-scenes moments that had never been recorded in official histories. During one such gathering, Thomas told the story of a state visit where he had noticed unusual activity among the crowd and quietly alerted security, preventing what could have been a serious incident. "The key," Thomas explained to the younger guards, "is to always be observant but never paranoid. Your job is to protect, not to frighten." These stories weren't just entertainment. They were masterclasses in professional judgment, situational awareness, and the subtle skills that made the difference between adequate security and exceptional protection. The guards were receiving training that money couldn't buy. It's delivered by someone whose expertise had been earned. Through decades of dedicated service, Thomas also began working with Captain Harrison to document procedures and protocols that existed, primarily in his memory. Many of the castle's security measures had evolved over the years based on Thomas's observations and suggestions, but they had never been formally recorded. Now, with Michael's help in writing and organizing, they were creating a comprehensive guide that would preserve Thomas's knowledge for future generations. The royal family members became increasingly aware of Thomas's situation, though it was never discussed directly. During ceremonies and official functions, they began acknowledging him with small gestures that went far beyond normal protocol. A brief personal word, an extra moment of eye contact, or a slight deviation from formal procedures, to include him more directly in important events. These gestures were noticed by everyone present and understood as recognition that Thomas represented something special, not just long service, but service of exceptional quality and dedication. The royal family was honoring him in the way they knew best, through subtle acknowledgments that elevated his status without compromising the formal protocols that govern their interactions. Michael witnessed these interactions with growing pride and understanding. He began to see his father not just as a parent, but as someone who had achieved something remarkable through decades of quiet dedication. Thomas had become a living symbol of the values that made the monarchy meaningful to millions of people. As spring progressed, Thomas's physical condition continued to decline, but his influence on those around him seemed to grow stronger. He had become a teacher, mentor, inspiration to people who would carry his lessons forward long after he was gone. The realization that Thomas's time was becoming more limited didn't create despair among his colleagues. Instead, it intensified their appreciation for every day they could still learn from him and support him in. His determined effort to serve until the very end, Thomas had achieved something extraordinary. He had transformed his final illness from a personal tragedy into a masterclass in character and dedication that would influence everyone who witnessed it. By May, Thomas's condition had progressed to the point where even his extraordinary determination couldn't completely mask the physical toll his illness was taking. His breathing had become more labored during long ceremonies, and he occasionally needed to use a discreet walking stick that had been specially crafted to match his uniform. But rather than diminishing his presence, these signs of his struggle somehow made his continued service even more powerful and inspiring to those around him. The castle staff had developed an intricate support system that operated almost invisibly around Thomas. Guards would position themselves strategically during ceremonies to provide assistance if needed. While maintaining the formal appearance that protocols required, Dr. Morrison had trained several staff members to recognize signs that Thomas might need medical attention, creating a safety net that allowed him to continue serving while ensuring his well-being. Michael had become an integral part of this support network, learning the rhythms of castle life and finding ways to help his father without interfering with his duties. He would arrive early on ceremony days to help Thomas prepare, ensuring he had eaten properly and taken his medications. Michael also served as a bridge between the medical staff and his father, helping communicate concerns and adjustments that Thomas's pride might otherwise prevent him from addressing directly. During this period, word of Thomas's situation began to spread beyond the immediate castle staff. Veterans organizations, military historians, and former royal guards learned about the man who was continuing to serve despite terminal illness. Letters of support and admiration began arriving at the castle, addressed to Thomas from people who saw him as an embodiment of the military and royal service traditions they cherished. Thomas was deeply moved by this recognition, but he remained focused on his daily duties rather than on his growing reputation. He had never sought attention or recognition beyond the satisfaction of performing his job with excellence. The external acknowledgement was meaningful, but it didn't change his fundamental motivation, which remained centered on his commitment to the crown and his colleagues. One particularly significant letter came from a retired general who had served alongside Thomas decades earlier during a state visit that had required extraordinary security measures. The general wrote about Thomas's professionalism and dedication during that challenging assignment, describing him as the kind of soldier who makes everyone around him better simply by his example. Captain Harrison shared this letter with Thomas during one of their regular meetings, and for the first time in months, Thomas showed visible emotion as he read the words of his former colleague. "I never thought anyone noticed," Thomas said quietly. "I was just doing my job." This humility was characteristic of Thomas and part of what made his final service so remarkable. He genuinely didn't understand why his determination to continue working was attracting so much attention. From his perspective, he was simply fulfilling the commitment he had made 37 years earlier when he first put on the uniform. As the summer approached, Dr. Morrison began having more frequent conversations with Thomas about his comfort and quality of life. His cancer had progressed significantly, and she wanted to ensure he had access to all the medical support that could help him manage his symptoms while continuing to work. "Thomas, I want you to know that what you're doing is extraordinary. Dr. Morrison told him during one of their consultations. Most people facing your diagnosis would have stopped working months ago. You're showing incredible courage, but I also want to make sure you're not suffering unnecessarily. Thomas appreciated her concern, but he had found a peace with his situation. That surprised even him. The daily routine of service, the support of his colleagues, and the presence of his son had created a sense of completeness that made his physical discomfort manageable. He was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he felt called to do. The younger guards had gone to understand that they were witnessing something they would remember and talk about for the rest of their careers. James Mitchell, who had become something of a protege to Thomas, started keeping a journal of their conversations and the lessons he was learning about service and character. Sergeant Whitfield taught me that being a guard isn't just about standing in one place and looking alert, James would later write. He showed me that we're guardians of something much larger than ourselves: traditions, values, principles that connect us to centuries of people who believed in service above self. Sarah Williams, the guard who had made it her mission to ensure Thomas ate properly, found herself learning lessons about grace under pressure that would influence her approach to challenges throughout her life. Watching Thomas face his illness with dignity while continuing to serve others had taught her that strength wasn't about avoiding difficulties, but about how you responded when difficulties were unavoidable. The royal family had begun to include Thomas more directly in their expressions of appreciation for long service. During a private ceremony recognizing staff members who had served for more than 30 years, Thomas was asked to speak about his experience and what service to the crown had meant to him. Standing before his colleagues and members of the royal family, Thomas spoke simply and from the heart. "I've had the privilege of serving something greater than myself for 37 years, he said, his voice steady despite his physical frailty. "This institution, these traditions, and these people have given my life meaning and purpose. Being able to protect and serve them has been the greatest honor of my life." The applause that followed was different from the polite recognition usually given at such events. It was emotional, heartfelt, and sustained, reflecting the profound respect and affection that Thomas had earned through his extraordinary example of dedication. As Thomas returned to his seat, supported discreetly by Michael and Captain Harrison, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something special. They had heard from someone who truly embodied the ideals of service and loyalty that the monarchy represented, and who was demonstrating those ideals in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The ceremony marked a turning point in how Thomas's colleagues viewed his final months of service. They were no longer just supporting a sick colleague. They were witnessing and participating in something that would become part of the castle's history and their own personal stories of what it meant to serve with honor. September arrived with the crisp promise of autumn, and Thomas knew instinctively that this would be his final season of service. His body was failing him in ways that even his remarkable determination couldn't overcome, but his spirit remained as strong as ever. He had achieved something he never thought possible. He had served with honor until the very end, surrounded by people who understood and supported his commitment. Dr. Morrison had been preparing everyone for this moment, helping Thomas's colleagues understand what to expect and how they could best support him during his final weeks of service. Rather than creating an atmosphere of sadness or defeat, her guidance helped everyone focus on making Thomas's remaining time as meaningful and dignified as possible. Michael had decided to stay in England permanently, realizing that his place was with his father and the extended family of colleagues who had become so important to both of them. He had found work in London that allowed him to spend time at the castle, and he was amazed daily by the depth of respect and affection that people felt for his father. "Dad, I never really understood what your work meant to you until I came here," Michael told Thomas one evening as they sat in the cottage garden. "Watching how these people treat you, seeing how much your example means to them, I'm so proud to be your son." Thomas smiled, feeling a completeness that he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Having Michael nearby during these final months had been an unexpected gift that made everything else more bearable. But equally important was knowing that his life's work had meaning beyond his own satisfaction, that his example was influencing people who would carry forward the values he had tried to embody. The castle staff had begun planning a celebration of Thomas's service that would take place while he was still able to participate fully. Captain Harrison was coordinating with senior royal officials to ensure that Thomas received the recognition he deserved, not as a farewell to someone who was dying, but as a tribute to someone who had achieved something extraordinary. The ceremony was scheduled for a crisp October morning, when the autumn light would illuminate the ancient stones of Windsor Castle in the golden glow that had witnessed centuries of similar tributes to loyal service. Thomas would be presented with a special commendation, recognizing his 37 years of dedicated service and his extraordinary example of loyalty to the crown. In the days leading up to the ceremony, Thomas received visitors from throughout the royal security community, former colleagues, current officials, and even some of the people he had protected over the years came to pay their respects and express their admiration for his commitment. Each visitor brought stories of how Thomas had influenced their understanding of service, their approach to their own duties, or their appreciation for the traditions they were part of protecting. Thomas listened to these accounts with surprise and humility, genuinely amazed that his quiet dedication had made such an impression on so many people. The ceremony itself was perfect in its simplicity and dignity. Thomas, wearing his dress uniform for what everyone knew would be the last time, stood as straight as his failing body would allow, while a senior member of the royal family spoke about his service and character. Sergeant Thomas Whitfield represents the finest traditions of service to the crown, the royal speaker said. Addressing the assembled crowd of guards, staff, and officials, his dedication, professionalism, and unwavering loyalty have set a standard that will inspire future generations of those who serve our monarchy and our nation. As Thomas received his commendation, the assembled crowd rose in a sustained ovation that reflected decades of earned respect and admiration. But the most meaningful moment came when his fellow guards, following an unspoken signal from Captain Harrison, began a slow, rhythmic applause that was joined by everyone present. It was a tribute that acknowledged not just Thomas's service, but his extraordinary example of how to face adversity with grace and dignity. Everyone present understood that they had witnessed something they would remember and talk about for the rest of their lives. Following the ceremony, Thomas was surrounded by colleagues who wanted to express their personal appreciation and say goodbye in their own way. The conversations were emotional, but not morbid, focusing on shared memories, lessons learned, and the impact Thomas had made on their lives and careers. James Mitchell, now a senior guard himself, thanks partly to Thomas's mentoring, spoke for many when he said, "Sergeant, you've shown us what it really means to be loyal to the crown, not just during good times, but especially when facing the greatest challenges. We'll never forget your example." In his final weeks of active service, Thomas continued to report for duty each day, though his responsibilities were modified to match his declining strength. He spent time with newer guards, sharing his knowledge and experience, and participated in ceremonies when his health permitted. The support network that had formed around Thomas remained strong until the very end. His colleagues ensured he was never alone, always had assistance when needed, continued to treat him with the respect and dignity he had earned through decades of faithful service. When Thomas finally could no longer physically manage even his modified duties, the transition was handled with the same dignity that had characterized his entire final year of service. Captain Harrison visited Thomas at his cottage to officially relieve him of his duties, but the conversation was framed as a well-earned rest rather than a defeat. "Thomas, you've given everything you had to give," Harrison said, sitting in the same garden where Thomas and Margaret had planned their future decades earlier. "You've shown us all what loyalty really means. You've earned the right to rest, knowing that your example will live on in everyone you've influenced." Thomas accepted this final transition with the grace he had shown throughout his illness. He had achieved his goal of serving until the very end, and he felt a deep satisfaction knowing that he had remained true to his principles and commitments. Even in the face of terminal illness, the final weeks of Thomas's life were spent in his cottage, surrounded by the people who had become his family through shared service and mutual respect. His colleagues visited regularly, not out of duty or pity, but because they genuinely wanted to spend time with someone who had taught them so much about character and dedication. Michael was amazed by the steady stream of visitors who came to see his father. Guards from different shifts, staff members from various departments, and even some members of the royal family made the journey to Thomas's cottage to express their gratitude and say goodbye. Dr. Morrison continued to visit, assuring Thomas's comfort, but also simply enjoying the company of someone who had faced his illness with such remarkable courage. "Thomas, you've taught me as much about dignity and strength as I've taught you about managing your condition," she told him during one of their final conversations. When Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep on a quiet November morning, the news spread through Windsor Castle like ripples on a pond. The man who had stood guard for 37 years, who had faced terminal illness with unwavering dedication to duty, and who had shown everyone around him what loyalty to the crown truly meant, was gone. But his influence lived on in ways that became apparent immediately. The guards who had learned from his example carried themselves with a deeper understanding of what their service meant. The staff members who had witnessed his final year understood more clearly what it meant to face adversity with dignity. The royal family members who had observed his dedication had a more profound appreciation for the people who served them with such commitment. Thomas's funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched through his service and his example. Current and former guards, royal staff, officials, and even some members of the royal family came to honor a man who had embodied the finest traditions of service to the crown. Captain Harrison delivered a eulogy that captured what Thomas had meant to everyone who knew him. Thomas Whitfield served with distinction for 37 years. But his greatest service came in his final months, when he showed us all what it means to remain loyal to the crown until the very end. He stood tall in the face of adversity, and we never let him face it alone. The phrase, "we never let him face it alone," became part of the culture at Windsor Castle, reminding everyone that true service meant supporting each other through every challenge. Thomas's example had created a legacy that would influence how the royal guards approached their duties, their relationships with each other, and their understanding of what loyalty really meant. Michael decided to remain in England, taking a position that allowed him to maintain connections with the community that had meant so much to his father. He became an unofficial keeper of Thomas's memory, sharing stories about his father's service with new guards and ensuring that the lessons Thomas had taught would not be forgotten. Years later, when new guards joined the service at Windsor Castle, they would hear the story of Sergeant Thomas Whitfield, the man who served with honor for 37 years and then showed everyone what true loyalty meant by continuing to serve even when facing terminal illness. His story became part of the training, not as a requirement, but as an inspiration. The cottage where Thomas had lived became a place of pilgrimage for guards who wanted to understand more deeply what service to the crown could mean. The garden where he had made his decision to continue serving rather than seek treatment became a quiet spot where people went to reflect on their own commitments and values. Thomas Whitfield had achieved something remarkable. He had transformed his final illness from a personal tragedy into a masterclass in character, dedication, and loyalty that would influence generations of people who served the crown. He had remained loyal until the very end, standing tall through every challenge, surrounded by people who understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, and who ensured that he never had to face any of it alone. His legacy lived on in every guard who stood a little straighter, every staff member who showed a little more dedication, every person who remembered that true loyalty meant remaining faithful, not just during easy times, but especially when facing the greatest challenges life could offer.